All guests are coming to you via the Fire Wings hotline. Try one of their delicious flavors of wings today. Fire Wings, just wing it. Let's bring him on. Dave Richard. He is our fantasy guru. He knows everything fantasy football-wise. I'm hoping Dave also. Did you ever see the show Superstars?
I probably did when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I don't really remember much about it. I was way into game shows when I was a kid.
Best one?
Yeah.
What was the best one?
The best game show when I was a kid?
Yeah, like what was the one that you really followed?
Probably Pressure Luck.
Oh, okay, no whammies.
It was a big deal in the elementary schools in suburban Chicago when the whammy had a Michael Jackson glove back in the day.
Wow, Pressure Luck. I do remember. They had the new Pressure
They
Luck.
do.
I can't get into it.
Yeah?
No, you got to go with the original. Peter Tamarkin and
Peter Tamarkin.
Old school whammy and those terrible graphics that they had.
Yes.
And, in fantasy, we'd all love to land on $5,000 and a spin.
That's right.
If a team had the Ravens defense and was playing in the first round of the playoffs another team that had Mark Ingram, and after that game yesterday, the team with the Ravens defense was down 24-15, would you consider that a win, a tie, or are they behind?
Yeah, they're behind.
Okay.
But it's not by a lot because you were never going to expect the Ravens defense to – you never expect a defense to – match up with the top running back on another team anyway. So,
right.
It's not a surprise.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we're at playoff time, right? I mean, I don't know what else. I guess there's some leagues that may not have a playoff, but anything different with strategy? If we're just talking strategy, obviously you're trying to put your best lineup out there. Any other tips just on the playoff version of fantasy football?
A lot of people tend to overthink at this time of year, and trust me, I do plenty of overthinking every day of my life, much less at this point of the season. But really, you got to the fantasy playoffs because you have good players on your team. You're going to keep starting the players that you think will do the best for your team. Where strategy might come into play could be after last night's game. Let's just say you went up against Mark Ingram or even worse, Lamar Jackson. You're down big. Anybody that's got a low ceiling, who you've been starting and you've been getting 8, 9, 10, 11 fantasy points from, if you've got an option that's got a little bit more upside, someone who could deliver just a monster game, you make the switch. And it's got to be somebody who you've seen deliver a monster game. You can't just make up in your mind that, Jimmy Graham could have a monster game, and then you start Jimmy Graham. No, he doesn't do that. But it's somebody like Will Fuller, for example, who just has sky-high upside. You go with that player instead of somebody like Larry Fitzgerald or Christian Kirk. They're just not getting a lot of great numbers from week to week. You take a few more chances with players who can help you make up that deficit that you're finding yourself in.
Now, at the same time, how many times in your experience have you seen somebody hit the playoffs and they get the yips, the equivalent of the fantasy yips, and they start overthinking it?
Yeah, I mean, you see it all the time. I get tweets and emails all the time. I've been starting Patrick Mahomes all year, but now I'm getting nervous over his hand. Do I start Eli Manning? Well, no,
right.
Absolutely not. You don't ever. If Patrick Mahomes is the quarterback that got you, and he's playing, he's active, he's going to throw a football, then yeah, you're going to keep starting him. That's a classic overthinking, and you just can't do that.
All right, instead of, we won't call it overthinking. Now, if you have, there's probably some rosters out there that might have been hit by a couple of injuries last week. So are there any players out there that if you absolutely have to pick up, and we saw Boston Scott go crazy for Philly, I don't know if that's reliable, but is there a player or two you said, you know what, it might be worth a pickup this week?
Well, I think you can start with Patrick Laird with the Dolphins, and I think he's widely available because no one really wants to start Dolphins running backs, but here's one that catches a bunch of passes and seems to be getting a lot of work, and he's taking on a Giants defense. They've been good against the run lately, but they played 85 snaps on Monday, and now they've got to play again on Sunday. And I think that Laird has a good opportunity to come through with a decent game there. You mentioned Boston Scott. I think he's got a PPR profile that might get you 10 or 11 points. Might be a sneaky DFS play, but I think he's going to continue to get playing time in that offense. There's a slew of receivers who you can make a case for, but they're all kind of in that range of, oh crap, I'm behind, I need a little bit of a Hail Mary. And even in that case, like Brashad Perriman, we'd be okay with him if Jameis Winston's hand were healthy, but he's got a fracture in his thumb. We don't know if he's going to play. So I don't know if you can count on him to be that guy. Marcus Johnson, Isaiah Ford, their circumstances could change considerably if guys who are injured come back this week, but they also have that type of crazy upside. But one receiver, there's two receivers actually, who had big games last week and people might be hesitant to buy into are Darius Slayton and A.J. Brown. perfect profile guys that give you high upside. And in the case of Slayton, especially, a nice safe floor. He's given you at least 10 PPR points each of his past 4 games. He's taken on the Dolphins. Their defense is terrible. Eli looked for him deep last week. It's what Slayton can do. I would anticipate Slayton having a pretty good week again. And A.J. Brown with the Titans had a monster game against the Raiders. I know you guys saw that one. But he's been up and down all year. He hasn't had double-digit fantasy points in consecutive weeks yet this season. So he makes me a little bit nervous, but still, with all the injuries that we see at wide receiver, he makes the cut as a top 24 wideout and someone you probably shouldn't hesitate starting if you're rolling out with 3 receivers.
CBS Sports Dave Richard joining us. We'll clean up some of the text line questions before we get to the phones. Just rapid fire for you here. Adam Thielen or Gallup, Connor, or Montgomery?
I'm probably going to lean toward Thielen there if it's PPR. If it's non-PPR, I'd probably roll with Connor against Buffalo.
Went with Matt Ryan all year. Obviously, they're listening to you. Stay with the hot hand. Went with Matt Ryan all year, but should I sub him out this week for Goff or Mayfield?
Well, this is an example of people, you might think this is overthinking, Dave, but I actually like both of those quarterbacks better than Matt Ryan because I think the 49ers can put a lot of pressure on Ryan. He struggles when that happens, and he doesn't have Calvin Ridley, so it's one less big target that he can accumulate fantasy points with. I would go with Goff against the Cowboys.
And then finally, how do you feel about, obviously it depends on who you have on the bench, but Aaron Rodgers at home, cold weather, Chicago. Are you worried about him this weekend?
You know, the only thing that I would say is in his favor is his track record at home against the Bears. He's been a monster against them, but he hasn't played like Aaron Rodgers this year. And this is a Packers team that likes to run the football. I think they try and be a little more conservative. I don't know if this is a game where unleashing Aaron Rodgers is going to be the secret to Green Bay's success. So I'm hesitant with Rodgers. He's not in my top 12 this week.
All right, let's see what Vince has to ask Dave Richard. Vince, welcome in. What's your question for Dave Richard?
Hey, Dave. So I'm in my semifinals matchup right now, and I actually gained some leverage last night, but starting Mark Ingram, and my opponent started the Ravens defense. So woohoo!
Nice. Yeah, you're in great shape.
So I want to try and put my foot on the throat of my opponent this weekend, and I'm having lineup issues with starting Adam Thielen in my second wide receiver slot, Devontae Parker in my flex, and on my bench I have Zach Pascal, A.J. Brown, Raheem Mostert, and Chris Thompson. Who you think I should start just to kind of get more upside and gain more leverage if possible? Thanks.
My guess is that you're going to end up starting Thielen, Brown, and Mostert because if T.Y. Hilton comes back, if it looks like he's ready to play on that game on Monday night, you're not going to feel good about Zach Pascal. And if Devontae Parker doesn't get cleared out of the concussion protocol, you can't use him. He's going to give you a 0. And Mostert looks like he's the primary back for the Niners right now. It doesn't mean he's going to get a ton of work, but he's been just so explosive, breaking tackles, making defenders miss, and he's been putting up good numbers. It's hard to get away from him. And Brown, you're talking about putting your foot on the throat of your opponent. He can help you do that, provided that he gets a good target share. He does have a great matchup against Houston. The Texans have allowed 6 passing touchdowns in their last 2 games.
Let me ask a fantasy football psychology question, Dave, which is always popular.
Absolutely.
We can fully admit this matters none at all in the real scheme of things. I'm just talking about jinxes and how you feel. Would you rather have a pretty commanding lead or a decent lead, but your opponent has a bunch of Sunday Night Football and Monday Night Football players and you're done? Or the reverse, you're down, but you've got maybe 1 or 2 guys on Sunday night and a couple on Monday night, and he's done?
I feel like I got to throw out the question, Dave. Psychologically speaking, I'd rather have the lead because I feel better when I'm winning.
Okay.
I think that's natural for people to feel that way, but we're talking about something where you've got no control over half of the equation.
Right.
What your opponent does with his lineup is his or her business. You can't do anything about it. And that's why it's almost not even worth looking at your opponent's lineup until after the Thursday game, just to see where you stand. So I think it almost doesn't really even matter. But if I had to answer your question, I would say, yeah, I'd rather have a lead because winning is cool.
It 100% does not matter. No, I've heard different sides of both equations here. No, to your point, though, about looking at your opponent's lineup, that actually, here's a real question for you.
Okay.
When is it beneficial to look at your opponent's lineup. And what I mean by that, Dave, is does it ever factor into your equation? Let's say you've got two receivers that are A1 and 1A, but you're playing an opponent whose quarterback is starting one of those receivers, is thrown to one of those receivers, or vice versa. You've got the quarterback and you don't want him throwing to the other receiver. Do you ever look at your opponent's lineup and base any of your moves on who they're starting?
No, because there have been tons of examples in the history of the National Football League where a receiver can have a good fantasy game and his quarterback does not. Or a quarterback can have a great fantasy game and his top receiver doesn't. Drew Lock last week, not that anybody is starting Drew Lock, but this is just a convenient example. He had 3 touchdowns last week. He was on fire. Cortland Sutton, who everybody was starting, only had like 34 yards, something like that. It was pathetic. So just because to answer your question, I don't ever do that. I don't even bother checking out who my opponent has because there's nothing I can do about it, and I still want to start the best lineup I can possibly make with the players available to me.
All right, let's check in on the phone lines again with Javier. Javier, you're on with Dave Richard.
How you doing, Mr. Richard and Carmichael Dave?
You.
All right, so I had a real strenuous playoff question. I have Will Fuller, I have Tyler Lockett, and I have DJ Chark, Devontae Freeman on my flex. I just started Marquise Brown. I need to start 3 of the 4. I'm not going to start Deontay Robinson unless you throw me, Walker right now, the receiver for Pittsburgh. I got 3 receiver spots in the flex. I'm trying to figure out who to start because Fuller is, he's a hit or miss every week, if not every other week, and then DJ Chark has a walking boot on his foot. And I think Lockett, he ain't been doing too much in the last 3 weeks or so. And Devontae, he gets by.
What is your specific question,
a
my
lot in
man?
there.
You're confusing me.
3 to 4, who do I start between? Fuller, Chark, Lockett, Devontae Freeman, and I can start 3 of those players.
Okay,
there we go.
Right. If Chark plays, you'll sit Freeman, but I don't think it looks good for Chark to play. So your decision's going to be made for you because of that.
Okay.
You might want to double check your waiver wire just to see what else is out there because I don't love the matchup for Freeman. I could get away with starting him in PPR, but in non-PPR, it's not looking good against the Niners.
Okay, let's go to Justin in Sacramento. Justin, you're on with Dave Richard.
Hi, Mr. Richard. How you doing?
Hello, Justin.
I have Chris Thompson or Matt Breida. I need to start one of them. Who would you pick?
Is it a PPR league?
It is.
I would go with Thompson over Breida. Breida's continuing to play well. He looked snazzy last week. He's just not getting a ton of work. That's a problem for him. Thompson's going to play passing downs and work alongside Adrian Peterson in a matchup against Philadelphia. And we saw last week he caught a bunch of passes. I think he could do that again.
And if T.Y. Hilton is healthy this Sunday, would you start him over Cole Beasley?
I think... Again, this is a PPR league. I think that's a tougher call. Beasley's been nails each of the last 3 weeks. He's been great in PPR. I think I might end up going with Beasley there.
Wow.
All right. Thanks for taking my call.
Hey,
Have a great day.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. If you're an owner of Chris Godwin, are you more nervous about Jameis's hand issue, or are you feeling better because Mike Evans is out and you're probably going to get more targets? Where are you with his value?
He needs Jameis Winston.
Okay.
I would be nervous about Chris Godwin having a big game if Ryan Griffin is his quarterback. He could have a good game with Griffin as his quarterback, and the matchup against the Lions is among the easiest in fantasy.
Sure.
But Winston needs to be close to 100% in order for him to come through, and last week we saw a lot of that from Winston where he seemed fine while he was playing, but now he's throwing a tennis ball in practice. He can't grip a football. It's Friday already. He needs to get out on the practice field and show that he can carry the offense. And if it's a shaky situation, they could end up making him inactive, or they play him, and if he just doesn't get the job done, then they switch to Griffin mid-game, and that would be a nightmare for anybody who starts Winston in fantasy. So today's a huge day. We'll find out what his status is later this afternoon. You can check back on CBSSports.com. We'll have the latest on him. But Winston is somebody who greatly affects a lot of players in fantasy.
All right, let's try Kelvin, who's next with Dave Richard. Kelvin, welcome to KHTK.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Hey, happy Friday. I just wanted to ask a question real quick about my flex. Made it to the semifinal, and I'm kind of nervous, and stake is high. Just wanted to know if you would, who would you select between Kenyon Drake, Amendola, or Scott from Philadelphia?
I'm going to stick with Drake there. It's a close call because I think that there's a chance that Amendola could get more than 5 catches, and Boston Scott could as well, but so can Drake. Drake's taken on the Browns. I'm confident he'll have the most touches of any of those 3 players, so he's the one that I think has the most upside for your team.
From the 209, no shocker there. If you have Lamar Jackson and a Week 17 Finals matchup, by the way, let me say it for Dave Richard, you should get out of that league. But if you have a Week 17 Finals matchup, is Trubisky a good enough backup if Lamar doesn't play, or do you think Baltimore's backup, Matt Flynn, would be the better start?
Matt Flynn, he's not Baltimore's backup. Baltimore's backup is RG3.
I'm just reading what they said.
Yeah.
I got you, Dave.
Ron Burgundy.
You could have covered for him.
I
though,
could.
You know?
I don't want to. The 209 is our
Let him
favorite
shine.
area code. Yeah, I want to let him shine.
Okay.
RG3, is that your guy?
No, and neither would Trubisky. Trubisky would be playing against Minnesota. I would look at someone like, I don't know if you're going to, it really comes down to who's on the waiver wire. Who's starting for the Giants that week? That might be the answer to your question. If it's Eli Manning or Daniel Jones, who are taking on Philadelphia at home, should be a favorable matchup. And maybe, just maybe, you look at the Steelers quarterback, because if the Ravens are resting guys, that means their defense is going to take a bench, and it'll be their backups playing. And Pittsburgh might be playing for a wild card spot. So maybe, and this sounds nuts, but this is what you get in Week 17, but maybe Devlin Hodges is someone that helps your fantasy team.
One other strategy thing, Dave, if maybe someone's out and they're in a keeper league, do you suggest anybody make trades now to like, hey, I'm looking for next year, I'm in a keeper league, maybe I can get somebody off someone's roster that I feel good going forward with?
Well, I mean, that's the type of move that you make in Week 9 or 10 before your trade deadline, assuming you have a trade deadline. And if it's a keeper league, there should be one there. If you're out of it and there's no, if you're here, let's just start here. If you're out of it in your league, you're mathematically eliminated. You shouldn't be allowed to make trades,
Agreed.
That's
whether
true.
there's a trade deadline or not,
Yeah.
because you're out of it. It's done. It's over with. And in a dynasty league, it's a little bit different. Keeper league, it's a little bit different, but it's still something that I guess you can't do, and you definitely shouldn't be able to do something like that at this point in the year.
Just before we wrap up, Dave, I just want to go back to a previous question. I think we both agree, right? If you're in a league that has their Super Bowl in Week 17, that you should leave that league immediately. Like, you should never, ever even be in it.
Unless there's certain rules in place where you can use the average fantasy points of a player that's sitting out and not playing at all, which I've seen before. You could do something like that, or there's leagues that try and drag on their fantasy season. You can use that player's stats in their playoff game instead of a 0 in Week 17. So just laying out a scenario, you're in your Week 17 final, you've got there with Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson's inactive. His next playoff game is where you'll get points from. But you got to wait 2 more weeks for that.
Well, okay.
So a lot of people, we don't have time for that. We want to win our fantasy championship now already, damn it. So you're probably going to just pivot to somebody else or just take the average. But yes, by and large, Week 16 is the week to have your fantasy championship.
And lastly, if there is a tie in a week, I had this in my league last week. Thank God it wasn't me. Both teams tied at 145.5. I know. Tiebreaker. First tiebreaker. Is it always bench? Should it always be bench points?
No, it should be the better seed.
Oh, I got. Interesting.
So if it's a matchup between the 3 and the 6 seed and they tie, the 3 seed advances.
What about regular season? If ties aren't allowed, then you have to have a tiebreaker. But they
then
don't.
Yeah, but that's on a league by league basis. You could just make that one, bench points, or the quarterback on your bench, or the DST points.
Do you have a preference?
No, I don't.
Okay. Right.
You know what my preference is? Decimal scoring, because then there's no ties.
Yeah, I know.
Almost never.
Almost never. All right, Dave Richard, he is the best, the brightest, and he is the future of fantasy football conversation and analysis. We got 30 seconds, which is just enough time, David, for you to tell everybody where you're going to be and how they can glean your knowledge.
You can go on Twitter at Dave Richard. I'm always tweeting there, answering questions, even on Sunday when you're making your lineup decisions. And if you're into DFS, which a lot of people are because they're not in their fantasy leagues anymore, we've got a show for you kicking off at 9 a.m. Pacific time on CBS Sports HQ.com. You'll learn the players that we like, we don't like, both on FanDuel and DraftKings, help you win a little money. And this time of year, that can help you out when it comes to spending on holiday gifts. So check us out, 9 a.m. Pacific on CBS Sports HQ.com.
Awesome. Dave, thank you so much. Have a good weekend. Enjoy the games, and we'll talk to you next week.
You got it, guys. Thank you.
The Drive.